Hi everybody, Annette from Sheridan Art and Designs. Today we're going to be working on Tanjiro from Demon Slayer, and we're going to start with his green and black Haori.
Okay, to start the Haori, you need strips of fabric, strips of black, strips of green, and then we're going to put those together into checkerboards that look just like this. These are called a 4-patch, and then that 4-patch will be turned into actual yardage that looks like this. So then we can cut our fabric pieces out of it. All right, so we start with putting our strips together. One black, one green. We're going to put them right sides together. And we're going to sew along the long edge of the strips. And we're going to do that with both sets. Okay, so we're just going to take our black and green strips, just like this, line up the edge so that the raw edges are perfectly lined up. I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance on this. And we're just going to stitch the entire length.
Okay, so we have pressed our strips open, and I've shortened my strips just so you can see them on the table, but this would be the whole length of the fabric. And what I've done is I've pressed my seams to the black, right? So the seams are headed towards the black, and I've done that on both, okay? Seams heading towards the black. And what that does is that creates a nice little, it's not very visible, but you can feel it. It's just a small ridge there where the seam is pressed. And that's going to help us nest our seams for the next step. So what we're going to do is line one strip up with our black on the bottom, green on the top. And then we're going to flip this one. And I'm going to clean this selvage off just before we get started. So I've got 2 clean cut edges. All right, and then we line them up. And what you can do, if you've never nested seams or done patchwork before, what will happen is that you can see I've got black to green, green to black, right sides together. Now when I lay these down, I can feel, I'm just moving my fingers like this, and I can feel them kind of lock into each other. And that's what I'm looking for, all the way down. I'm going to lock those seams together. That way I know that my strips are aligned and straight. sure my edges are aligned and straight and my seam is nested. I'm going to be using 2 rulers for this next step. I have my 12.5-inch ruler and I put some washi tape on it to measure 4 3/4 because that was the width of my strips. And we need to make squares, so we use the same measurement. Again, keeping everything lined up. And I'll just take my 24-inch ruler and I'm just going to gently butt that right up against. So double checking all my measurements, 4 3/4, making sure that my rulers are straight and everything's lined up. Then I can just push my 12.5-inch away, make the cut, and then I have a pair all ready to be sewn. So what we're going to do is take them to the sewing machine after we cut all of our strips, and we're going to sew on this long edge. And when we do that, when we open it up, we'll have what's called a 4-patch unit. So we'll put that aside, and I'm going to continue cutting the rest of my strips. And you don't want to move your rulers back and forth, especially if I'm using a satin. So fabric's very slippery, and I want to make sure that everything stays nice and lined up. Seams nested, edges are lined up. So I'm just kind of gently placing my rulers once I have everything lined up on to the fabric. Again, 4 3/4, making sure my strips are all straight and even. That my ruler is straight and even. Now, we always want to do our best cutting and sewing, but I have oversized these slightly, so I will be trimming them down. So there's a little bit of forgiveness if your cuts aren't exactly perfect. Okay, so we've cut all of our strips and we have them in nested pairs, all ready to go to the sewing machine and stitch together. I'm going to stitch along this long edge. Okay. Let's go over to the sewing machine.
Okay, so we have our stack of matched pairs that we've cut together. I'm just going to I'll set them over here so I can easily grab them. And then what we're going to be doing here is just making sure the long raw edge is matched up. And again, making sure that seam is nested nicely, butted up against each other. Okay, so we're going to be stitching on this long line here, all along this line here, and making sure this seam is nested. Again, 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you can see I've set my units such that the black is on top and the green is on the bottom. And I've done that because this seam here, we want this to be going in that direction, feeding into the presser foot. And if that's going in that direction, that means the seam on the bottom is going towards me. And what that will do is it will lock the nested seam together and we'll get a nice point in the center of the unit. If you flipped it around and had this seam going in this direction, the unit would slip when it went through the feed dog, and you might not get that really crisp point in the center of your unit. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch this one. I'm going to use my stiletto, lift up my presser foot, and just make sure everything's laying flat and that seam is still nested nicely. It's okay to stop and adjust things. And then once it goes through the presser foot, you just go ahead and stitch down the rest of the length of the unit. And I am going to back stitch these. Normally I would just, if I was quilting, I would just, and I was using a nice cotton, I would just chain piece these. But because I'm using a satin that unravels very easily and it's very slippery, I want to make sure I've secured those ends, because I'm going to manhandle this a lot by the time I get it into yardage. All right, so now when we open that up, hopefully you can see, and get it over here, you can see we've got a nice, all of the points comes right in there and there's no gap. Everything meets exactly the way it's supposed to meet. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and stitch this whole pile of units together. Okay, we've finished sewing all of our 4-patch units together, and now it's time to go over to the ironing board and get them pressed. One of the things that we're going to do is, and I'll show you this in detail after I press them, but I'll show you a special way to press out that center so you don't get there's 4 seams coming together in that center. So I'll show you a special way to press that. All right. See you after I get these pressed. Okay, we've got all of our units sewn together across the long line there, the long seam, and now the next step is to press the block. So a couple of things that we're going to be using here. I'm using a wool pressing mat. You don't have to, you can use a regular ironing board, it's just fine. I'm using an iron with steam. So I do have it filled with water and I have it set to the appropriate setting for the type of fabric that I'm using. And so we will be using steam with this. And then I have this wooden oblong block. And what this is called a clapper. It's a wooden clapper. And it's used in garment sewing for really getting flat, nice flat, crisp seams in your garment. And you can see that with my units, it's not perfectly flat, right? So there's a little bit of wave in there. And so what I want to do is make sure that I'm getting these nice and flat and crisp and pressed, the seams pressed in a clockwise fashion, so when we go to sew them together, all the seams will nest appropriately. So this is one that I've pressed, and you can see the seams are really nice and flat. That steam really crisps it up, and the clapper just really makes sure that there's no puckering or any kind of pull or anything in, and the seams are very, very flat. So no additional bulk. And this is what the back side looks like. So you can see we have our seams going in a clockwise direction, and we've got this cute little 4-patch unit in the center, and I'll show you how to do that in just a second. So pressing our blocks, the first thing that we're going to do is create this little 4-patch in the center. And how we're going to do that is we're going to take our unit and we're going to grasp the center just on either side. So I'll get this close, hopefully that you can see that. So we're grasping just on either side of this seam allowance in the center. And this is our the seam that we just sewed right across the top, right? So we're going to grasp on either side of that center, and we're just going to give it a little twist. And that's all. You can see right where that little 4-patch unit opens up in the center. Now, we haven't broken any of the stitches in our seam. Our seam is still there. If we were to open this up, you would see our seam is just fine, right? Haven't broken any of the stitches here. What I did do is pop open the stitches that were holding the ends of the seam allowance in the center all together and causing that big bulk. So by giving that little twist, we can now open our block. And now this is how I can, if this was all one piece, I'd have to press it either that way or this way, or open it up and press it flat, which we don't want to do any of those things because we want to be able to nest our seams in the next step. So now I can actually press, even though I stitched this in one long seam, I can press it in different directions so that my seams all go in a clockwise direction. So what we're going to do, and I'm going to just kind of spread the fabric a little bit, because when you're pressing from the back, what you don't want to have happen is you don't want to press in a seam in the front or a pucker in the front. So I'm just going to spread that so it's nice and flat, and then I'm going to bring the iron in and just lay that right on top. So that seam is going towards me, and I'm going to give that a little shot of steam, and I'm going to move across, and I'm going to press this seam away from me, and I'll give that a little shot of steam. Just make sure it's nice and flat. And then while that's nice and hot, I'm going to take my clapper and I'm going to place that clapper right on top. Now I'm not pressing hard down on my clapper. I'm just holding it in place. I'm letting the weight of the wood do the work for me. And we're going to let that just sit until the fabric is cooled, and you'll feel the heat radiating up and know when that's cooled off. And then as we take that clapper off, you can see we've got a nice, perfectly flat seam. And so now we need to do these ones. So I'm going to repeat the same process, right? Just laying that down, giving it a little shot of steam, and then immediately putting my clapper down and holding that in place. You only need to do it for about 30 seconds or so until you feel that the fabric is cooled. So fabric has memory, and when you apply steam to it, it's very pliable and you can shape it. But as it cools, it will hold that shape, which is what we want when we're pressing. Because if I've laid that clapper on here and kept it there until the fabric is cooled, now it will remember that it has to stay, these seams have to stay flat going in that direction, and I can move it around and those seams aren't going to change. It's still staying nice and flat. Now for the last step in pressing your block, so I'm going to press it from the top side as well. just because I want to make sure that I'm taking any kind of wrinkles or puckers out, especially in those seams right down the middle there. And then I'm just going to lay my clapper and again going in the other direction. And there you go. You've got a perfectly pressed block. Okay. So I'll show you that twist one last time. So here's the seam that we stitched, right? And then we're just going to grasp on either side of that. So you can see I'm grasping on just on either side of those seams. This is the seam allowance that's stitched right here. Either side, and just twist, and it pops those stitches right up, and then it stops when it reaches our horizontal seam. And then we're ready to go press. All right, so I'm going to press the rest of my blocks, and I'll see you back here when I'm done, and we'll continue on with cutting our blocks down to a perfect 8.5 inches.
The next thing to do is to trim these down to a clean 8.5 by 8.5. And as I said, I oversized my units a little bit so that I could trim them down to exactly 8.5. And I didn't have to worry about any kind of shrinkage or anything happening while I was sewing them together. So this is why I'm using my square ruler. And how you use a square to square up a 4-patch unit like this is that half of 8.5, first of all, I have a 45-degree line that runs right through here. I'm not sure if you can see that cleanly or not, but it runs right there. This is where my 45-degree line is. So I've got that lined up from corner to corner. That's the first thing I do. And then half of 8.5 is 4 1/4. So I want to take my 4 1/4 measurement, which is just a small dot right there, but I'm going to actually put that right in the center of my 4-patch so that the center of my square remains the same. And then the next thing I'm going to do, so I'm going to make sure my 45-degree is going from corner to corner and that my 4 1/4 dot is right in the center of my 4-patch. Now the next thing I want to do is make sure that on the bottom and on the left, I have fabric that extends beyond the 8.5 inch line. That's because I'm going to trim these two sides and then I'm going to turn the unit 180 degrees and then I'll trim the remaining two sides. So I don't want to take all of I don't want to trim the unit down to 8.5. So if I just did this and put the 8.5 in the corner, I'd be taking off 1/4 of an inch all the way around. I'd still get an 8.5 inch square, but my center wouldn't be in the center anymore. So you want to make sure that all 4 squares are exactly the same size, and you do that by lining it up. Again, 45, 4 1/4 in the center. I have my square is bigger than 8.5 all the way around. And then I'm just going to trim up the right side and across the top. And you can see I'm not taking very much off. It's very little fabric, only about 1/8 of an inch. Then I lift my ruler, I pick up my unit, and I turn it around. Again, I line it up exactly the same. My 4 1/4 dot goes right in the center. My 45 goes through, but this time I'm going to put the left and the bottom edges exactly on the 8.5 inch mark. Once I have everything lined up, straight up the right side and across the top. And there I have a perfect 8.5 inch unit that's ready to get sewn in the next step. So I'll put that one aside and go ahead and trim the rest of my units down. So now that we have all of our 4-patch units trimmed down to 8.5 inches square, and we have all of our seams pressed going in the clockwise direction with the center opened, we are ready to start our row assembly. So what we'll do, for my rows, I'm using 11 blocks. So each row will consist of 11 blocks, because that's the length of yardage that I need. So in order to calculate how many blocks you need in a row, you would simply fit the Haori pattern to yourself or your model, whoever you're making it for, get the finished length that you need, and then you would just divide that by an 8-inch square. I know our blocks are 8.5, but that's because they include seam allowance. Once we put them together, they'll be 8 inches finished. So you want to divide the total length, front and back, of the Haori by 8 inches, and then that would give you the total number of blocks. Now, I made my blocks 8.5 inches cut or 8 inches finished because the overall measurement was easily divisible by 4. And so my finished block, each one of the squares inside my 4-patch unit will finish 4 inches. So if you want all of your seams to match and you want all of your blocks exactly the same throughout the whole design of the Haori, then first determine the overall length of the Haori. Then that will tell you two things. It'll tell you the number of blocks and the size of the block that you need. Okay, now that we've had our math discussion for the day, here is what we're going to be doing. This is very much similar to the last step where we were sewing the units together to make the 4-patch unit. Now we're sewing 4-patch units together in order to make a row, and then we'll just sew the rows together to give us yardage. Then we can lay our pattern pieces out and cut that out, but that will be part 2. So what we'll do here is we're just going to put our 4-patch units together like this, making sure that we've got black to green and green to black. And we're going to nest that center seam just like we did before, and then we're going to stitch along this side. And then when that one's done, we'll just add the next one and the next one and the next one until you have your row complete. Then when you have your row complete and it looks like this, then you'll just put your next row on that so that you will build that out, and it will eventually look like this. So I have 2 more rows to make to have enough width for the both front and left and right sides of the Haori. And I'm going to run my center seam, the center back seam, straight down one of these seams so that I don't have a split block in the center. So that's why I'm making a little extra yardage. All right, but that's part 2. Part 1 is making the yardage that we need. Okay, so I'm gonna head on over to the sewing machine with my blocks and make my last row so that I can get these put together.
Okay, so we've stitched our rows. So all of our 4-patch units have gone into our rows, and we have our rows now made up. And now it's time to put our rows to our yardage. So if you're just starting out, it'll be 1 row. You're going to sew 2 rows together, then add another row and add another row. So you can see I already have 1, 2, 3 rows done, and I'm getting ready to add my 4th row. I'm doing 5 rows across, which will be plenty of width, I believe. I will test it with the patterns. But all right, so what we're going to do is, I have mine folded in half so it'll fit on the table. But we're going to use a lot of the same techniques that we used in putting our 4-patch units together. So you're going to line up your row with your other row. So you've got your 2 rows together, and you're going to put those, you want to make sure you have black to green, green to black, and then we're just going to flip that so we've got right sides together. All right, I'm just going to open this up now. Okay, so we have right sides together, and remember all that nesting that we did. We're going to do some more nesting. So again, I'm checking I have my black to green, green to black, and now every 4 inches we're going to have a seam to nest. And if you've pressed your seams in a clockwise direction all the way through, then your seams are going to nest up very nicely all the way across. And then that will allow you to get these perfect center points at every intersection. So you really can't even tell where each 4-patch unit is. It all blends together nicely. All right. So I'm going to head over to the sewing machine and stitch this row onto our yardage. And we're done. So now we've got all our yardage already put together and ready to cut out the Haori, which will be part 2. So if you like this video, please hit the subscribe button below, and we'll see you back here for part 2 when we cut out the Haori and put it all together. Thanks for watching.